Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Wednesday, April 9th. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. After colony collapse disorder devastated U.S. honeybee populations 2 decades ago, honeybee numbers have generally been stable until this past winter, when record numbers died again of mysterious causes.
Pretty soon it was overwhelming. We just couldn't keep up with the amount of dead hives coming in.
Coming up, a look at what mass honeybee die-offs mean for the San Joaquin Valley. But first, these news headlines. President Trump has imposed sweeping tariffs of up to 50% on imported goods, and tensions over tariffs are especially high with China. But some Republicans are also pushing back on the White House's tariff actions. Hanford Congressman David Valadao said this past weekend he would consider supporting a bill that would allow Congress to block some tariffs.
This is one of those powers that belongs in the Congress, and we should be looking at that in, I think, a very serious manner.
As a former farmer, Valadao says he also understands that some tariffs are necessary to create a level playing field for U.S. producers. As the Trump administration revokes visas from hundreds of international students across the country, including dozens on California campuses, 2 Southern California students are pushing back. From our California newsroom partner KQED in San Francisco, Tyke Hendricks reports.
Advocates say at least 50 California students are affected so far, including at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, and Stanford.
We believe that these terminations are unlawful.
That's Khalid Al-Rabe, a Bay Area attorney with the National Lawyers Guild. He's representing 2 Southern California students suing the federal government.
The fact that the students have maintained lawful status, have been in compliance with all the requirements of their student status, and yet still being punished for that is very concerning.
A State Department spokesman says the agency, quote, revokes visas every day in order to secure America's borders and keep our communities safe.
That was Tyke Hendricks from our California newsroom partner KQED. Meanwhile, 36 students in the Cal State University system have had their visas revoked. It's part of a federal crackdown on international student visas across the country. Campus officials couldn't say how many students were affected at Fresno State, but at CSU Bakersfield, no students have had their visas revoked so far. Meanwhile, UC students are also being affected. UC Merced officials tell KVPR that 4 of its students have lost their visas. The U.S. Border Patrol has said its agents targeted criminals when they detained dozens of Kern County residents in January. But a new investigation by newsroom partner Cal Matters found that most of those arrested had no criminal record. KVPR's Kerry Klein reports.
Border Patrol officials said 78 people were detained in Kern County in what was called Operation Return to Sender. An agency leader said its operatives had a list of people with criminal records when they drove hundreds of miles from the Mexican border into Kern County. But Cal Matters and its partners found that Border Patrol misrepresented its immigration raid and that only 1 of those arrested had a known criminal record. At least a handful of those who were detained were in the country without legal status. The investigation also found some encounters appeared to be random, with some people detained outside businesses and on their way to work. For KVPR News, I'm Kerry Klein.
Raise a glass with KVPR, Sunday afternoon, May 4th, for KVPR's wine tasting and more, featuring fine wines from California and beyond, local craft beer, delicious food, live music, and a silent auction, all on the amazing grounds of the Lester Estate in Fresno, where Van Ness Extension meets the San Joaquin River. All proceeds benefit KVPR, so purchase your tickets today at kvpr.org/wine.
And now to our main story. We just wrapped up the deadliest winter on record for commercial honeybees. They not only make honey, but they also pollinate more than 100 U.S. crops for a total of $18 billion in agricultural revenue. KVPR's Kerry Klein reports from Tulare County, where the bee industry is scrambling to recover from these sudden, massive losses.
Tucked away on the outskirts of the city of Visalia is a honey farm. It's got chickens, pet cats, and lots of bees. How many bees do you think are in the air right here, right now?
30,000 maybe?
David Bradshaw has been a commercial beekeeper for 50 years. His bees pollinate almonds, avocados, kiwis, and olives. He also sells honey. But this past winter, something strange started happening at his bee boxes.
You're expecting a lot of bee activity, bees flying in and out, collecting pollen, nectar, and there's no activity. And as you open the box, there's no bees.
Some of his bees had deformed wings. Others were dead or just gone.
We try to clean it up as it comes in, but pretty soon it was overwhelming. We just couldn't keep up with the amount of dead hives coming in.
Of the 1,800 hives he started with last fall, just 320 survived the winter.
It's what did I do wrong? I mean, I'm a very bad steward of my bees. It really hurts.
But this didn't just happen to Bradshaw. Starting in January, bee researcher Danielle Downey says beekeepers all over the country were calling bee scientists in a panic.
So it was like the bees were slipping through their fingers in days.
Downey runs a nonprofit research organization called Project Apis M. It's named after a species of honeybee. Her group surveyed the majority of the nation's commercial beekeepers and found they lost an average of 62% of their hives just this winter.
These are the highest losses ever recorded.
According to the USDA, for the past few decades, bees have struggled with what's called colony collapse disorder. Scientists haven't been able to identify a single cause. They say pesticides and a parasite known as varroa mites could play a role. That disorder peaked around 20 years ago, but annual deaths of around 30% of commercial bees are still considered normal. So why so many more losses this year? Downey says they don't know yet.
Is there potentially a new virus? There's resistance to the compounds that kill the mites. There's always a concern about pesticide exposures.
Government scientists are analyzing samples of bees, larvae, and honey to try to figure out what happened. But Downey says the Trump administration's cuts to the federal workforce have slowed this work down.
The USDA scientists that we work with on these things who have been heroically showing up to help us in this crisis, they're in their own crisis, watching their friends get fired and worried for their own jobs.
The USDA didn't answer questions about whether employees at its bee labs were fired, but said in an emailed statement that scientists are working to identify the source of the die-offs.
This is a smoker, and smoke has a calming effect on the bees.
Dustin Reeder is a commercial beekeeper in Terra Bella, California. He's also a bee broker, trucking in bee boxes from all over the country to pollinate California almonds, then stone fruit. Some move on to Washington apples and canola flowers in North Dakota. Even with so many losses, Reeder says he has scrounged together all the bees his clients have needed so far, but the experience has been grueling.
This year, I was working at least 20 hours a day. I was not able to come home at night. I stayed in my truck, and I'd get a few hours of sleep, and I'd keep going.
Farmers and trade organizations say it's too early to tell what these losses will mean for ag. But Project Apis M estimates beekeepers are poised to lose hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm Kerry Klein in California's Central Valley.
And Kerry joins me now to share more about her bee reporting. Hey, Kerry.
Hi, Liz.
So first, Kerry, we covered this topic previously on our March 5th episode, but it was really compelling with your story to hear directly from these beekeepers and how they're being impacted by these die-offs. Mm-hmm. These bees do play a critical role in making sure all of our millions of almond trees here in the Central Valley are pollinated. Do you have an idea of how many bees come to the valley every year?
Yeah, I mean, it's enormous. It's an enormous amount. We have roughly 1.5 million acres of almond trees in all of California. The vast majority of them are in the Central Valley. And there are upward of 2 million hives needed to pollinate them. And each hive could have tens of thousands of bees in it. It's enormous. And that's upward of 2/3 of all the bees in the U.S. in a normal year come to California for the almond bloom. That's the biggest stress on honeybees is the almond bloom. And then after that, they disperse because more than 100 crops rely on pollination. And so bees then move on to pollinate apples and peaches and apricots and plums and kiwis and olives and canola and lots of other things all around the country. Interestingly, not all of these crops help bees produce honey, at least not honey that tastes good to humans. And so some of the best crops for honey are oranges and citrus, but they don't actually need bees in order to grow. At least a lot of varieties don't. So interestingly, for some crops, the farmers need the bees, and for honey, the bees need some different farms.
Interesting. Now, did you hear from any farmers that were not able to get the bees that they needed because of this mass bee die-off?
Amazingly, no. I mean, the asterisk there is that I can't possibly speak to all the almond farmers here, but most bee brokers that I spoke to said they were able to find all the bees their clients needed, and the almond growers I spoke to said they had all the bees that they needed. Some reasons for this are that, brokers were able to find new beekeepers around the country that they haven't always gone to in the past. So they're getting bees from all these different corners of the country that they might not have usually tapped into. Also, here during almond bloom, the weather was pretty good. The temperature was very mild. There wasn't a whole lot of rain. That means that bees can fly more hours of the day. And so basically you can get more out of fewer bees. This is what a lot of farmers in a farm bureau, explained to me. One broker also told me that because of the weather, almonds in the San Joaquin Valley tend to bloom earlier than in the more northern parts of the state. So if anyone did lose out on bees, they were likely further north because they were putting in requests for bees later on in the season. I think this is interesting because it kind of speaks to how resilient agriculture can be all around.
And I presume, too, that there's not an easy way to just breed more bees, that it would take a while to get back to a particular population size. Do you have an idea of how long it will take for some of these bee farmers to recover?
That is a super interesting question, and this may be where I learned the most from this reporting. There are ways to build up hives. So as long as bees have food and are thriving, they do reproduce more. And it is common to split hives into new ones. Beekeepers are doing this all the time. To do that, you actually need new queens. I certainly do not understand and cannot explain scientifically how this works, but beekeepers can coax bee larvae into becoming queens, using special cases to grow them. And then once they've grown, you can put those queens into new hives, and then drones and worker bees will follow them and create new colonies. So this is how beekeepers create new colonies each year, and they expand and grow the ones that they have. And so by the end of the season, a lot of beekeepers could be back up to the normal number of hives that they had before all these losses. But when bees focus their energy on reproducing and growing and expanding, they're focusing less on pollinating and producing honey. So that's why this still likely represents a big economic loss for those beekeepers.
KVPR Associate Editor and reporter Kerry Klein, thanks for this great reporting.
Yeah, thank you, Liz.
And that is today's show. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
This is Tanya Mosley, co-host of Fresh Air. You'll see your favorite actors, directors, and comedians on late-night TV shows or YouTube. But what you get with Fresh Air is a deep dive. Spend some quality time with people like Billie Eilish, Questlove, Ariana Grande, Stephen Colbert, and so many more. We ask questions you won't hear asked anywhere else. Listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.